here we are, Vintage Vegas 4 with legends, and I mean legends. Yep. I see Bob over there. He doesn't want to be called a legend. I don't know why. He is a legend. Live with it. You're a legend in journalism, and it's just a great day. And we're going to start with Jane Ann Morrison. Can we put some photos up? Not great photos, but I'll tell you what, they represent the day. And we're going to start with Jane Ann. Jane, don't underestimate her. She's had her life threatened. I'm just going to talk about it, and she went after the best. Here's our crew, guys. The great Ned Day.
Okay, Bob, the legend, come on up. I'm going to have everybody tell you a little bit about themselves, and then I have a question. Well, I have actually many questions. I always take notes because of the time when I was on live TV with Frank Rosenthal, and he gave me the "I hate you" look. And I totally froze, just lost everything. And, but I looked down, I had my notes, I looked down. It seemed like the longest 30 seconds of my life. I managed to recover. So, Smith, John L. John L. is the only one of us who was born here. So he probably can say he is are you leaving? Okay. And these two guys, along with myself and George Knapp and Ned Day, covered the mob during the 70s and the 80s. And the next guy coming up, if you count some of the politicians as the mob, he would count as covering them. That would be John Ralston. I'm going to start with the question that I get asked all the time, which is, you covered the mob. Did you ever get threats? And were you ever afraid?
The answer
is that one working?
the answer is yes. I think most of the media during that period got threats in one way or the other. At KLAS TV during the 70s and the 80s, we spent a lot of time and money replacing headlights and taillights that were taken out by baseball bats. Ned Day, whose picture you saw up there, his car was firebombed. It was a time of well, I'm not sure how many of you were here during the 70s and 80s, just to get a sense of what it was. Well, in those days, rather than the impeachment being on the page, the front page of the paper every day, it was organized crime. Every day in the Las Vegas Review-Journal, which was leading the way in many ways, the Las Vegas Sun, local television stations, every day there was a story on the mob. And so it was part of everybody's life in this town. And of course there were threats, but we didn't really take them seriously, although we probably should have.
I'm going to skip to John L. here because you had some threats.
Yeah, over the years, you kind of collect them. But a very wise guy, by that I mean a wise person, once told me that son, don't worry about the ones who call, worry about the ones who don't. And so that's, although a bit chilling. I mean, I remember one during a more modern investigation. I was writing, making fun of some people's girth, probably, or poking fun at them, and I received what I considered a valid threat, and it went up through channels and wound up being reported to the FBI, and it was cleared up, which was nice. But yeah, it's also just part of the job. Yeah, you get threatened. It's like I was going to say, it's nice to be back at the Golden Nugget when I'm not under a litigation by the owner of the Golden Nugget. So there's a lot of threats that you go through in your career, right? So some are from the street and some are from the penthouse.
Ralston, your threats came in a different way. Can you explain that? You were covering the mob, if you consider politics the mob.
Well, I actually feel kind of out of place among the three of you, not because at least most of you are older than I am. It's more because every one of these folks up here actually were brave in journalism. I mean, John and Bob, you already saw some of the pictures. That John has written books, and Jane Ann covered a lot of stuff. You saw some of the pictures there from federal court when you covered it. I mean, they actually, there was real bravery involved in what they wrote and put on the air. Mine is somewhat more trivial in comparison. I mean, I could tell you a great Billy Walters story. I could tell you about how a guy who now lives at 1600 Pennsylvania called my producer. I don't know if you remember this, Bob, Dana Gentry, when we were doing something about occupancy at Trump Tower. And of course, his default, first of all, she was shocked that he came on the phone. And his default position was, you better watch what you guys put on the air, or I'm going to sue you. And that is a true story. I don't know if you remember that or not. And we put Mr. Trump's name on the air and then said that we had talked to him. But my favorite threat story came in the 90s when Bob Miller was governor. And there was a lot of writing nationally about George Bush the First and his wimp factor. And Miller was waffling about a business tax and whether he would propose it or not, and which he eventually did. But he was waffling on it, so I said he was trying to get over his own wimp factor in a column. And that day that the column ran, there was a breakfast event. I forget what the event was, and he came right up to me and said, and pointed his finger in my face and said, "Let's step outside and see who the real wimp is." Now, I think Bob then and now probably could have taken me pretty easily, so I didn't really want to take him up on that. His press secretary came and pulled him away, and I thought that was the end of it. But of course, the very nosy George Knapp called me and said, "What's this about Miller threatening you?" And so I told George the story, and next month, George was a stringer for Time magazine at the time. They gave Miller the Put Up Your Dukes Award. And I'm still pissed at George to this day because Miller's name was mentioned, but not mine.
The threats I had were not from Tony Spilatro, who supposedly killed, was it 22 men, 22 people? It wasn't from Frank Rosenthal, who had the way of looking at you like he'd like to step on you, and he was the front man. So for those of you who don't know, Tony was, the Stone Cold Killer, and Rosenthal was the front man for the Argent Company, and he was, some of you may remember his awful television show, where he got some of the top names in the business. He was definitely connected, and I'd like to boast for a minute. Everybody, certainly John L. and I, and Stodall, and knew that he was cooperating with federal officials, but nobody would confirm it until he died in 2008. And I'd like to brag that I was the first person to get law enforcement to go on the record and say, yeah, he was cooperating. Now, they never would tell me, well, what was he giving? But on all these investigations that were going on, 78, 79, he never got indicted for anything. He was investigated for everything, but never got indicted. So, but the threat I got was from a crazed politician, and we took it seriously. I can tell you his name, and he's dead now, which I'm Well, I shouldn't say I'm grateful, but I am.
Sensitive
And-
type.
And his name was Hillary Michael Milko, and he was running for everything. He was a Republican, going to lots of Republican events, and he just made the back of my neck crawl. And so I think at one point he was running in a primary against Harry Reid. Well, we're not going to give you, you don't have any money, you don't have any support. You're not going to get the same kind of coverage that Harry Reid got, sorry. And so he called me up screaming and yelling and saying he was, going to kill me. And I said, why don't you talk to my editor? He talked to the editor, and she kind of told him off. And so then he threatened her. So he was banned from the Review Journal, from going in at all. So one evening, after hours, when everything's locked up, there he is wandering the halls. Our crack security team, had not done its job. He was wandering around, and like I said, he gave me the willies. So a few years later, he's in an armed standoff in a domestic dispute in California. So I knew he was unstable, and I was glad that I kept my distance. The only other threat I got was from a guy in prison, and he threatened me and Bob Miller. And when he threatened Bob Miller, my boss says, when he threatened me, nobody cared. When he threatened Bob Miller, because Lonnie Hammergren was the lieutenant governor at the time, when he threatened Bob Miller, they took it very seriously, and we reported it. And they got back to me and they said, the guy's never going to get out of jail, don't worry. So.
Gina, there's one, we kind of joke and laugh about it, but it was a very serious time. These were bad guys. These were killers. These were guys that would put somebody's head in a vice and squeeze it, and that occurred in Las Vegas. And it wasn't just the media. Local officials were also very worried. Former County Commissioner Bob Broadbent, we had him come over to Channel 8, which is located about a block from the Las Vegas Strip. We're going to talk about the Stardust and Spilatro and Rosenthal and that whole crew at Argent. So I said, Bob, why don't we just go over to the Stardust, and we'll do it right in front of the place, and we'll do it right there with a Lido sign right behind us. And he said, okay. So as he's getting into the van, his jacket opens up, and there is this pistol that is stuck, and he had to pull it out, and it was almost like a buntline special. I mean, it seemed to be that long. And he carried it with him all the time, or at least during that period of time. So those folks were concerned as well. That was the tone, that was the atmosphere in town. And I think because of the RJ, the Sun, and Channel 3, and Channel 8, and the Valley Times, you have to remember, there were three active newspapers in town. 3 active newspapers, not one and a portion of a newspaper. There were 3 active newspapers in town. A couple of radio stations were very active, and all 3 television stations were just hammering this all the time. So it was something everybody was living and breathing on a regular basis. It was not a year, it was 2 years, it was 3 years, it was 4 years. It was a long period of time of coverage in this community.
Bob, you want to tell the story about Landra Reed and the car that was set up for a bomb?
Well, maybe John L's got a little bit more details on that particular. That was, he was head of the control board, Harry Reid?
Commission.
Oh, just the long and short of it is, this is a story that's been told a lot, but as a gaming commissioner, Harry Reid was threatened, had his life threatened. The event occurred in the driveway of the family home where a wire was discovered hooked from a spark plug to the gas tank. And that was, it made a lot of headlines, but it also, had something like that occurred and gone off, it would have been an even much bigger event. But it was found, so that's kind of the short version of it.
And that incident actually came up during Reid's 2010 race for re-election when Sue Loudon, who everybody thought was going to be his opponent, went on Heidi Harris's radio show, and there was this, excuse me, this famous colloquy that they had where they both said, I've never heard of such a thing. I don't think that really happened. There was never anything written about that. And they went back and forth for like 10 or 15 minutes as if this was a completely fabricated story by the evil Harry Reid. And it was like, at this time, Google did exist, Sue and Heidi. You could have easily found this. And so I found it for them and let them know that it had occurred. But that was really something. And of course, you guys know about this. There's that famous piece of videotape, right, with Frank Rosenthal yelling at Harry Reid during a gaming commission meeting. That had to be kind of scary, right?
Of hands that there were maybe 4 of you that were over 50 and did. Las Vegas was going through one of its transition periods in that time. It went through several, certainly during the war, and I'm talking with the overlay of organized crime. You had Siegel and Sedway and Lansky and this facility, although not this, but particular place. This was built by Guy McAfee, and a real organized crime figure out of Southern California for a couple of decades. He came here when they kicked him out, but he was he had a good sense of business, and he had a good sense of what the future was of gambling. He actually came up with the concept in 1944 of building a beautiful facility out on the Las Vegas Strip, well in advance of Bugsy. But this place was built by Guy McAfee in 1946 and was built as a gaming facility. Everything else had been converted from a grocery store into a gaming place. But this was the first place that was really built as a gambling house. So that was a transition. Then we went into the transition of the 50s and then into the 60s. Many elected officials, a federal judge, still had their foot in the 30s or the 40s and 50s and the 60s, and forgot to lift it and move it forward into the 70s and 80s. And that was the same thing with a lot of the gambling figures. They still wanted to operate the way they used to get away with it, and they no longer could. And those 70s and 80s, it was 2 decades that really had to turn the corner from organized crime figures being in control of this industry till what it is today.
And if the movie that captured this era was Casino, and if you haven't seen it, it's very bloody, but the De Niro character is the Frank Rosenthal, and the Joe Pesci character is Spilatro, and
the Oscar character is Oscar.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
But just think about if you haven't seen it. Let me echo what Jane Ann says. Do see it because it's only 97% accurate.
It does leave a number of things out, but when you watch it, it captures the era, it captures the clothes, it captures the look, and it certainly captures the dreadful things that were going on in Las Vegas at that time. And so I think that, John, you did some work that you said other columnists didn't do. Now, John and Ralston were columnists. I was a straight reporter and later became a columnist. So he had a little more freedom to do certain things. Do you want to share that with us?
Sure. I'm a local kid, right? Despite the whitening hair and all. So I was raised in a family where we were involved in Democratic Party politics and in union politics in the building trades in the community. And in those days, the building trades and the service community, culinary workers essentially, they mixed better than some would argue that they do today. And so my phone at home rang constantly. It rang constantly with calls from people like Al Bramlett, who was murdered in '77 by the Hanleys, a father and son hit team, who were very popular at Binion's Horseshoe and also friends of the local sheriff in those days. So it was a different time. I can tell you that there was a time in Las Vegas when people did not think it would change. I'm completely convinced of it. Other people disagree with me, but completely convinced that Las Vegas would always be that place with that 5 o'clock shadow on it. And so growing up in my house, I heard those voices, was essentially kind of shirt sleeve privy to the conversations with my parents. And so I grew up with that in the back of my head, understanding that those were the people. And when they turned up in the police blotter as, hitmen, or when they turned up dead in the desert, that was part of the Vegas reality. Well, that reality has evolved, certainly, and we've become, in my opinion, a much better community, bigger, more diverse. This is a great group to set that example. And so, to get to your question, when I became a columnist, I approached my job differently. I hung out at Johnny Toko's gym for years, right? In part because I enjoyed my friend Johnny, who was sent out from St. Louis by John Vitale, who was, Johnny was out here to do some work and stayed and was a boxing trainer and all of that. I mean, that was the Vegas that I knew. And I didn't know a lot of the other stuff that goes into writing a column. However, I did know some of those characters. I'll give you just a couple of characters. Frank Caravello, he was an electrician in town. He also was a member of an Eastern crime family. He was a loan shark. He would be sent money. He would improve that money by putting it on the street, usually through his union. Now, this is a guy who's made a few headlines. He's gone now, but he was a very interesting cat. When I found him and got a number for him and called him and said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you. You've got a garbage contract that you're trying to sell up in northern Nevada, and I'm going to write about it, so you might as well sit down with me." Right? This is back when Bob Miller was governor. And so that's the proximity that I tried to get to the people that were essentially organized crime people. It wasn't always successful. I mean, I called John Conti, a Lucchese crime family member. I called him while he was cruising through. Now, in the new era, after Spilatro, right? After Spilatro, people tried to turn back the clock in Las Vegas. They tried to pretend that the big changes had not happened. And so guys would come out from the east, sometimes from LA, but mostly from the east. They would come out and they would be the new guy, right? The Buffalo Mob in the wake of Chicago. The Buffalo Mob, they were the new guys. Well, they had telemarketing in town. They had some successes, but they busted out. But I also would go to the bars where they hung out to watch them sidle up to the legitimate citizens in our community. So when people talk about the mob, they talk about organized crime. There's no organized crime without complicity. Complicity from judges, from cops, from politicians. That's organized crime. So it's not just the baggy pants guys that I bumped into and occasionally wanted to hit you over the head. It's that. That's real, in my opinion, that's the real mob in the community. Whenever there's that crossover, that's where the trouble is.
And for those of you who like history, and since this is Vintage Vegas, I would highly recommend you watch one of the best pieces of television journalism I've ever seen, which is Mob on the Run, because you can see the faces, the action, the reality of it. Bob, go ahead and talk about it a little bit and how difficult it was to make.
Well, difficult is an interesting word. The general manager of Channel 8 came back to the newsroom and said, "We've got to the Super Bowl this year, and we've got a half an hour we need to fill after the Super Bowl. Can you guys come up with anything?" Well, 2 years of organized crime, and so yeah, we can put together something real fast. And again, a half an hour with 11 minutes of commercials. That's 19 minutes. We can do that in an hour. We'll get it done. We went back, we being Ned Day, went back and started editing and putting it together. Well, a little longer. It came in at 47 minutes, so we went and talked to the general manager. He says, okay, we'll drop a game show, but you need to tighten it up a little bit. So we went back and started editing, and it got longer. Because we kept finding footage in our files, historic files, that had been organized, and Mob on the Run would not have become what it is if it wasn't for Gwen Castaldi, one of the great reporters in this town. She had gone in and organized all the footage that we had gotten from New York and Chicago and St. Louis and New Orleans, put it all in order. So we're going back and editing this stuff, and we're finding it. So it wound up being a 2-hour documentary. And we did it in about 6 weeks. Largely, Ned would write something, we'd find another piece of video, then he'd go back and rewrite it. We put it on, and everybody liked it so much we ran it 6 more times within the next 2 weeks. As I look at it now, remember we did it in 86, I think it was about the time. 87, 1987. It's dated, but see Mob on the Run first, and then see Casinos. And if you see the movie, if there's any similarities between what we did but that's another story. But it's a good documentary. A lot of faces that would help you recognize and put things in perspective.
So you are the Scorsese of Las Vegas.
Well, I think that's what I'm trying to say. I modestly you say that.
I'd like to answer a few questions or ask these guys questions. I'm retired, so I'm not working in today's journalism world, but all 3 of these guys are. And I'm kind of interested, what's the good, what's the bad of journalism today versus the 70s?
Well, all 3 of us are affiliated with the same organization, and that's really all you need to know, Jane Ann. That's it.
I started my job at the Review Journal, sweeping the floors in the back room. These guys were a little bit tired, but I think what John is referring to is something called the Nevada Independent. If you haven't seen it, please go online. It's the Nevada Independent. It covers the state like no other news organization. And both these guys are affiliated with it. John organized and built it, and John L. is one of the important writers to it. And when you go online, and after you have read the work that they have done, there's a little spot there where you can make donations.
Bob is my favorite guy.
It is a nonprofit, and we survive on donations. And your donate. One of our rules is if you donate, it's transparent, so you can see who has given to us, and that's an important story unto itself.
Okay, is the advertisement over?
Well,
Never. It's never over. Never.
Okay, because the question was, how has journalism changed today? For the good and the bad.
Jane, one thing you learn from covering politicians all the time is to answer the question you want to answer, not necessarily the one that you asked. Let me just say real quickly, I think it's with anything else. There have been some changes for the good and some changes for the bad. And many of the people in this room already know what they are. I was just saying this to somebody. We live in the greatest age of information in the history of the world, thanks to the internet, but that means we also live in the greatest age of bad information in the history of the world. And people have become, unfortunately, less discerning in where they will read, which gets me back to I'm kidding. When I got to the RJ, in 1984, in many ways, I think it was the golden age of the RJ. There were no fewer than half a dozen reporters in that newsroom. And this isn't just from the perspective of a callow kid showing up at his first job. I've looked back on it a lot. And there were some phenomenal reporters there who could have been worked at the New York Times or the Washington Post. Jane Ann was one of them. Larry Werner, Kent Lauer, John Glish. There were people there who really are as good as any reporters that are in this town now. And there were people who passed through Channel 8 through the years who I think Bob would say are the same way. He'd match up against anyone that's on TV here now. And the Sun had some great reporters as well. And so it's just what's depressing about it is the fracturing of the industry, the way that the media has fallen into disfavor, some of our own doing, but more because of attempts to delegitimize what journalism is, and for people to call themselves journalists who are not. And so it's become much more difficult, I think, to pierce that and to say to people, come, look at us, trust us. And I'm not just talking about the Independent. I'm talking about anyone who was in journalism. It's harder now for the New York Times. It's harder now for the Washington Post to say you should trust what you read there, because people just don't trust anymore. Too many people don't.
John.
Just briefly, one name that John inadvertently left out is Major Garrett, which you'll see on national television. A great reporter, a really fine guy, and he came through the Review Journal and made his mark there on his way to bigger things. So yeah, the good news is that there are more choices, and you just have to make the choice. It's one of the things we were talking about in the lobby. It's a matter of participation. If you want to be a passive news consumer, and be spoon-fed. Whatever, you're going to be spoon-fed only the sweet stuff that you like. You're not going to read what's good for you. So hopefully, you participate in the process. You'll find out what works. You'll find out what's factual, and not just what agrees with you. We've got a conflation of that in our society more than ever. I think it's not just about what I agree with. It sometimes facts really do matter, and it's hard. It's hard with all the noise. It's hard to ferret them out and to make up your own mind on things. It's a challenge. But I think as far as this community goes, I think there's a lot of great stuff going on. I mean, the Independent, I can't possibly suck up more than Stoddall did.
You could try.
I'm just a freelancer there, and that's why I'll be cleaning up after and taking all this food home. No, really, I'm not kidding. No, but there's a lot of good stuff going on, and that includes at the local newspaper. When I some of the reporters at that paper, I think are fine reporters and better people, and so there's a lot going on that's good. It's not all doom and gloom.
Bob, one of the things that I notice in the paper, and I'm sure the two Johns do too, is the lack of historical perspective. And then it's true on the television as well. There's a lot of inaccuracies. I sometimes cuss the TV out. I cuss the newspaper out because they don't correct things. Can you, you're the historian in the crowd. You really care about facts. And can you give us any thoughts about the challenge between history and journalism?
I like both of them. I mean, they're so closely tied together. What we're doing today is going to be history tomorrow. I mean, it just gets. Although I'm not sure we're making history here, but the point is that today's lunch is tomorrow's history. I think one of the challenges, and John L. touched on it, which is one of my pet peeves. When I was born, we had the radio and we had the newspapers and then we had television. And those were the things that we could digest. We had newsreels as well we could go see on Saturday mornings. It was easy, it was passive. Now you have to work at it, or you can just be spoon-fed, as John said, and find out which channel that you like that feeds what you're looking at. It's harder to do it today than it was 5 years ago, than it was 10 years ago. It takes more time. And everybody in this room is very, very busy already. Not to have the additional responsibility, and it is a responsibility, to understand what is going on in this world. It's the BBC, or it's, you go up to one channel 127 and see French 24, how they see the world, and it's different than what we're getting. So you really need to work on it, and one of my goals is with working with the great team at the Mob Museum, there's a lot of things that are wrong that gets repeated over and over about the mob. These were not colorful guys. These were bad guys, and we've sort of, in some ways, the Mob Museum hasn't. But the media and movies and so forth have made these guys sort of the Godfather figures, and it's just a lot of crap. And so that's the short way of saying we need to clean things up, and we're doing that at the Mob Museum. Another plug for some great guys. And we do have moonshine available. It's now going to be in your local stores, including Lee's Liquor.
John L., do you have something to plug?
No, I can make something up. No. Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, KNPR State of Nevada, I think is an excellent program, despite the fact they let me on once a week. I really think that getting an interview live, hopefully live interviews on the station, I think it's really important, and it's important for every medium in journalism to talk to the public officials, get them on the record, and get out and essentially get them live. Keep them out from behind their gatekeepers. Now, those of you who don't know necessarily what that means, more and more in corporate America, in politics, in public office, it's more and more difficult for journalists to penetrate that front door, the door that used to be, just smile at the secretary and work the room there. And now you have to pass through a security check to get to your public officials, and you also have to pass through other ways that they keep you away. Now, it's not just about whether John or Bob or John or Jane can get in. It's about whether you can get in, because you're busy with your life, right? What we do is we knock on that door and we try to get past that door to ask the questions that you would ask if you had the time. And so it's important for us to keep pushing for things like open records laws, for the will of the people to be heard, rather than the will of the few and well-connected who already have a key to that door and can get past it. So,
but real quickly, since John brought it up, and we're talking about the difficulty of getting good information, and to some extent the shrinking of journalism, especially in this community. And you talk about how many shows now exist where politicians are being interviewed or newsmakers are being interviewed. There's almost none left in this town. But more importantly, and you mentioned it, I would be remiss not to mention what's happening at KNPR and how much trouble the NPR affiliate in this community is in, which is a disaster for this community if it were to go away. Now, you may think I'm being melodramatic, but I'm not. And after you write your check to the Nevada Independent, you should seriously consider, I'm being facetious, but what really is going on is KNPR, it would be terrible for this community as a city the size of Las Vegas not to have a robust NPR affiliate. They have some real serious problems. Maybe they'll get to the bottom of why exactly it happened. To me, that's secondary to making sure that it stays alive. And so I really think that everybody in here should, and John is absolutely right, that's about the only window you can get to having a live interview with a public official or with a newsmaker to try to get to the bottom of things. And taken from somebody who used to, for 15 and a half years every night, have public officials or newsmakers sitting in front of me. There's a different, that you can get more information that way and different kinds of information doing that. So KNPR needs to be saved.
I hope you've picked up something of worth value besides plugs, but that's a legitimate plug. That's a legitimate one. I mean, when I came to town in 76, you called the governor, you got the governor. There was tremendous access. There wasn't this layer of people that you had to go through. There wasn't a press spokesman who was saying whatever he or she was told to say. And at that point in journalism, you put these people, politicians. You tried to talk to mobsters, but I think you saw from my picture over there that they're not real talkative. But that kind of change is one of the depressing parts of today's journalism. Thank you.
So listen, for me, I was fascinated and riveted by that. I love this. I love Las Vegas so much. I love our state. And I think that we should never, ever forget about how we got to where we are, because then we won't know where we're going. And these guys were in the middle of it, and I'm so appreciative that I know you guys don't do this often, and I know the only reason John Ralston did it was because of me. But other than that, just kidding, Ralston.
I was
Here
told,
we go.
I was told you were going to announce your candidacy today, Peter, for because this guy's running for something.
Well, what I will guarantee here is you will be the first to know, and I promise you that. With that, I hope you've enjoyed this. This is Vintage Vegas, and I'm grateful for all of you being here. Thank you.